Okay, so this is part B of chapter 28 on the female reproduction system. So we defined menarche and menopause last time. That was one difference between male and female, the limit of the reproductive capability in females. Another is what we're going to cover here. So, cytokinesis is the division of the cell organelles, cytoplasm, and cell membrane, so not the nucleus. Typically, when cell division is taking place, this is going to create a set of organelles for each new nuclei. However, in the production of ova, you have unequal cytokinesis. It produces one viable cell with all the organelles, and then it produces what we call a polar body. It's going to be a nucleus without organelles. It's got a cell membrane, but it's going to basically die off. Now, if we were in a botany class, we'd have another discussion about what we use polar bodies for, but as animals, we don't use the polar bodies. So they're going to die off and get flushed out. And so every time there's a meiotic division, it's going to generate one viable cell and one polar body. And that's what this is illustrating over here. Okay, so that's another difference between the two genders. Okay. Another difference is that the developing ovum is housed within another structure called a follicle. We're going to define 3 different stages of follicles. The primordial follicle is what we're going to see as a single layer surrounding the oogonium. And these are produced before birth. So when you're born, you already have the potential ova in the ovaries that you could possibly release. So these are some of the oldest cells in the body. They make up the bulk of the ovarian cortex. So that's what we see here and here. Okay. It's going to pretty much stay that way when the ovary is produced during fetal development until usually puberty. Primary follicles are the second stage that we're going to define. And primary follicles have multiple rows of granulosa cells surrounding the primary oocyte. These are going to start developing in the ovarian cortex during puberty, depending on how much follicle stimulating hormone is secreted. It takes at least 2 or 3 cycles to prepare that primary follicle in order to finish development in a single menstrual cycle. So it has to be prepared, and the number of primary follicles depends on how much follicle stimulating hormone reaches individual follicles. The granulosa cells are important because these are the cells within the ovary that secrete estrogen. So as the number of granulosa cells increases, so does the volume of estrogen that's produced. Okay. Then, once we get to a certain stage, and your textbook goes into secondary and tertiary follicles, but we're not going to get into that because it doesn't last very long. The matured follicle, or called the Graafian follicle, is what we see here. And in this microscopic illustration as well. It includes the primary follicle, which is this area here with that darker area. Now it has a secondary oocyte, and additional rows of granulosa cells. Oops, the darker ones. And this light colored area is the antrum. The antrum is a fluid-filled pocket that's going to provide nutrients for the developing ovum and fluid for the developing ovum. Okay, so then we have the terms ovulation, corona radiata, and corpus luteum. So ovulation, which is what we see here, and what we see, oops. Let's see if I can move that. There we go. Ovulation is what we see down here in this corner. It's the release of the secondary oocyte from the ovary. So during ovulation, part of the material is going to stay in the ovary. Oops. Part of it's going to leave. The secondary oocyte is going to leave, and it's going to be surrounded by the corona radiata. And so that's from the surface. That's what you're going to see here. And that's going to be this material around the secondary oocyte. That's what's going to travel along, hopefully, along the oviduct towards the uterus to be fertilized. The corona radiata is the layer that the acrosome on the sperm is going to have to penetrate in order for fertilization to occur. The corpus luteum is the part of the follicle that stays in the ovary and is transformed due to the luteinizing hormone. And it's going to secrete progesterone first, and then it will also start secreting estrogen. So when we look at this, we also need to notice something else. At the point or site of ovulation, there's what we call a stigma, and that's going to create a scar on the surface of the ovary. If the ovary is big enough, you can count that scar and see how many times ovulation has occurred. If this doesn't separate, then it can become a cyst, typically estrogen and progesterone are hormonally dependent. So it can increase and decrease in size depending on the volume of hormones secreted. Sometimes after separation, it can also become a cyst that may not be hormonally dependent. Okay, so oogenesis. Again, you have a table. During the process, the first cell produced is the oogonium. You'll have another column in that table than you had previously. So the oogonium is surrounded by the primordial follicle, which we see here. It has the diploid amount of DNA with single strands. Again, these are produced prior to birth. That cell, because of follicle stimulating hormone, is going to mature into a primary oocyte, which is surrounded by the primary follicles. It also has the diploid amount of DNA, and it also has 2 strands or is double-stranded chromosomes. The primary oocyte is the one that undergoes meiosis 1, and you get 1 secondary oocyte, and you get a polar body. The secondary oocyte is initially surrounded by the Graafian follicle, and then it's going to be surrounded by the corona radiata. So you'll have 2 in that follicle, 2 answers in that follicle place. Secondary oocytes have haploid amount of DNA, but they still have double-stranded chromosomes, so 2 strands. Now, we're going to put the last 2 together because the ootid doesn't last very long. So the ootid/ovum, which there's going to be one of, is going to be surrounded by the corona radiata. Because the acrosome just penetrates it, it doesn't dissolve it completely. It has the haploid amount of DNA, and it has 1 strand. Now, this only happens or only develops if the corona radiata has been penetrated by a sperm. No sperm, no meiosis 2. So it's the secondary oocyte that gets sloughed off in the menstrual cycles. It's a secondary oocyte that is typically sloughed off during menstrual cycles. Now, birth control pills, so-called birth control pills, do not prevent pregnancy. They reduce the likelihood of implantation. And that's attaching of the embryo to the wall of the uterus. So fertilization's already taken place. So it doesn't stop pregnancy, it reduces the likelihood of the pregnancy finishing. Okay, oogenesis, oogonium, primary oocyte, secondary oocyte, ootid/ovum. And the last one only happens if fertilization occurs. Okay, another scenario. Now, just because the corona radiata has been penetrated by a sperm, and just because meiosis 2 has occurred, doesn't mean that fertilization occurs. The sperm nucleus has to unite with the ovum's nucleus to form a single nuclei for it to become a zygote. So yes, you can have what they call a blighted ovum, and it will have 2 nuclei, but it doesn't form a zygote. And so it can cause false positive pregnancies tests because it triggers all the changes, but it doesn't finish out because there's no zygote that develops. And so, yes, it's possible for fertilization to initiate, but not be completed. Okay, Then we have menstrual cycles. Menstrual cycles are cyclic changes that happen within the, try to move that down, within the, ovaries and within the uterus. They average between 20 and 45 days in length. The 28-day is the average or mean length. In some women, it's the same length every time, and in others, it varies all the time. So, ovarian changes are going to cause the uterine changes, typically divided into 3 phases per cycle. There is also, what they don't reflect in this picture, an overall change in body temperatures and a chemical interactions between estrogens and neurotransmitters like serotonin and norepinephrine. Okay, one big change in the body temperature is going to happen near this line. There's a drop in body temperature that corresponds with this line here, and that actually lines up with ovulation. Okay. So we'll go over the ovarian changes and then the uterine changes. So you have a table to fill in. There's a column for the name of the phase, the length, and then changes in the ovaries, and then changes in the uterus. Remember that the changes in the ovaries are going to cause the changes in the uterus. So we can call it the preantral phase or part of the follicular phase. It averages 3 to 6 days. In a 28-day cycle, you can see it lasts 5 days. Primary follicles, and primary oocytes are going to mature. Now, keep in mind that this started 2 or 3 months ahead of time and now reaches a culmination point. Again, because of follicle stimulating hormone, and that's this blue increase here. Notice it started previously, so it does start, and then it's going to decline. In the in the uterus, you have the menstrual phase. So you have another name. This is when the endometrium is being sloughed off due to buildup from the previous cycle. And this is because the levels of estrogen and progesterone are going to diminish because the corpus luteum died off. So you see the sloughing off of the endometrium with the developed secondary oocyte from the previous cycle. So the menstrual phase is actually evidence of a previous cycle. Okay. Second phase is called the pre-ovulatory phase, or the rest of the follicular phase. This is the one that varies the most. So this is why you can have a 20-day cycle, and this is why you can have a 45-day cycle. So for length, just put varies. In a 28-day cycle, it's day, let's see if I can find, yeah, day 6 through day 13. The primary oocyte divides, producing a secondary oocyte. The follicle matures, secreting lots of estrogen, which we see down here. It ends with a surge, a small surge in follicle stimulating hormone, but a dramatic surge in luteinizing hormone. The supposition is that luteinizing hormone surge is what triggers ovulation. Anyway, it at least happens before that. In the uterus, we have the proliferative phase. It involves the endometrium thickening due to the increase in estrogen levels, which is coming from the matured follicle. The third phase is called the post-ovulatory phase or luteal phase. It lasts 14 days. 99.9% of the time, it's 14 days long. The corpus luteum develops because of the corpus luteum develops because of the luteinizing hormone. It begins secreting progesterone, and then it secretes estrogen. So it's going to start fairly soon. This is a fully matured corpus luteum, but it starts building up and producing the hormones as soon as ovulation has occurred. The secretory phase is what we call the phase in the uterus. It's when the endometrium becomes even thicker and begins secreting various substances. So it goes from this height up to there. And that red line should be moved over. Anyway, the again, the hormones coming out of the ovary are going to cause this secretory phase. Okay, so then what happens? It depends on what happened back close to ovulation. So if pregnancy occurs, if fertilization takes place, the corpus luteum is going to be maintained so that it can secrete progesterone and estrogen. Another hormone that's secreted is the human chorionic gonadotropin. Again, you're going to need that for your hormone assignment. It maintains the corpus luteum until the placenta can take over secretion of estrogen and progesterone. The endometrium is going to be maintained, and it develops the placenta and houses the developing fetus. If pregnancy doesn't occur, then the corpus luteum is going to die off, and we go into the menstrual phase and preantral phase. Okay, keep in mind, just because pregnancy occurs and the menstrual cycle stop doesn't mean you're pregnant. Just because they keep going doesn't mean you're not pregnant. So there's no absolutes. There are some women that continue to have menstrual cycles because even a slight drop in progesterone or estrogen can cause sloughing of the endometrium. It may not be enough to terminate the pregnancy, but there are women that still have menstrual cycles during pregnancy. And there may be some other reason why menstrual cycles stop other than pregnancies. A lot of times, like I mentioned earlier, with the percentage of body fat, when that gets too low, the body can't sustain development of both or maintaining life in the individual and develop a fetus. Okay, a diagram that's in both chapter 27 and in 28 will help you with your hormone assignment. The hypothalamus is what secretes the gonadotropin releasing hormone, which tells the anterior pituitary gland to secrete either luteinizing hormone or follicle stimulating hormone. The luteinizing hormone, regardless of gender, is going to trigger hormone production. Follicle stimulating hormone is going to promote the maturation and or production of the gametes. They were both named in the female reproductive system first. And then when they decided to look at hormone control in males, they found it was the same chemical. The luteinizing hormone then triggers production of either testosterone or the estrogens and progesterones. Keep in mind, back in the endocrine system, that we convert cholesterol into progesterone first. Then we convert progesterone into testosterone. Oops. And then you convert testosterone into estrogen, or the active version, which is estradiol. So yes, everybody makes all three. And estrogen can be converted back into testosterone. And that does happen, especially in adipose tissue. For some reason, adipose tissue is prolific at reconverting that back. So again, both genders make all three hormones. And so that's the end of chapter 28. And that would be the end of your lecture material for this course.